When Europeans reached North America, they found a continent that seemed largely empty. Vast forests, open plains, scattered indigenous communities. The large, dense, permanent urban settlements that European explorers associated with civilization were largely absent from the landscape they encountered. This absence became part of a story that shaped centuries of colonial ideology. North America as a wilderness, its peoples as primitively organized, its land as effectively unclaimed. What was not obvious was that the largest city in pre-Columbian North America had already been gone for nearly 2 centuries before the first European expedition reached its territory. Not destroyed by European disease or conquest, gone on its own terms, for its own reasons, 200 years before any European arrived to ask. That city was Cahokia. It sat at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, in what is now southern Illinois. At its peak, around 1050 to 1200 CE, it had a population estimated at 10 to 20,000 people, larger than contemporary London. It had pyramidal earthen mounds that still stand today. The largest Monk's Mound is the 3rd largest pyramid by volume in the ancient world. It had a precisely astronomically aligned circle of timber posts, a trade network stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, and a cosmopolitan immigrant population drawn from communities across eastern North America. Monk's Mound covers 14 acres at its base and rises 30 meters. An estimated 50 to 55 million cubic feet of earth were moved to construct the full complex of more than 120 mounds. This was accomplished without metal tools, without draft animals, without the wheel. The people who built Cahokia were not building a small ceremonial center. They were building a capital. By 1350 CE, it was abandoned, emptied, 2 centuries before Columbus, and the ancient DNA, together with the isotope and sediment evidence, has now produced the most complete reconstruction yet of why. For most of the 20th century, the collapse of Cahokia was attributed to vague factors: resource depletion, political instability, drought, perhaps epidemic disease. The explanations were unsatisfying because they were untethered from specific evidence. Cahokia left no written records. Its people had no writing system. The only evidence was material: the archaeology of the mounds, the ceramics, the burial goods, and eventually the human remains themselves. The ancient DNA and isotope evidence gathered in recent decades has settled one part of this debate. Cahokia was a city. The isotope signatures of the people buried there show that many of them were not local. They had grown up drinking water and eating food from geographically distant places, then migrated to Cahokia and lived there for years before death. The strontium isotope ratios in their bones are inconsistent with the local floodplain geology. Cahokia was drawing migrants from hundreds of kilometers away. It was a place people moved to, not just a place people visited. This makes the collapse more puzzling, not less. Cities that draw immigrants are generally growing. Something stopped the growth of Cahokia, turned the immigrant flow around, and emptied the city over the course of a century or so. What the evidence now identifies is a sequence of interacting catastrophes that unraveled the city from multiple directions simultaneously. The most significant environmental evidence comes from sediment cores extracted from Horseshoe Lake, a former Mississippi River channel adjacent to the Cahokia site. In 2015, a team led by Samuel Munoz at the University of Wisconsin published an analysis of the Horseshoe Lake cores in PNAS. What the cores showed was a record of flood events in the Mississippi River system going back several thousand years. The timing of one flood event was striking. The sediment record shows evidence of catastrophic flooding of the Cahokia site around 1100 CE, precisely the period when the archaeological record indicates the city was at its population peak. The flood would have inundated the residential areas around the base of the mounds, contaminated the agricultural fields that fed the city, and disrupted the water supply. The 2015 study proposed that this flood event was a turning point. Before the flood, Cahokia was growing and expanding. After it, the archaeological evidence shows a different pattern: residential areas contracting toward the higher ground of the mounds, evidence of increased conflict in the burial record, and the beginning of a slow but sustained population decline. But the flood alone does not explain the full scale of the collapse. For the isotope and DNA evidence on what happened to the population, researchers turn to the human remains themselves. Ancient DNA analysis of Cahokia skeletal material has been limited by the sensitivity of indigenous communities to destructive analysis of their ancestors' remains, but the isotope work has produced significant results. Strontium and oxygen isotope signatures spanning the full history of Cahokia document not just the immigrant character of the population at its peak, but the change in that character as the city declined. In the later phases of Cahokia's occupation, the 12th and 13th centuries, the proportion of locally born individuals increases relative to immigrants. The immigrant streams that had been flowing into the city were thinning. People were no longer coming in the same numbers. This matters because it identifies the collapse mechanism, not primarily as death, an epidemic or a massacre that killed the population in place, but as dispersal. The people of Cahokia left. They left gradually, over decades and generations. The city did not die in a catastrophe. It emptied by stages as people chose not to stay. The drought evidence complicates and deepens the flood story. The American Midwest in the 12th and 13th centuries experienced significant climatic instability as the medieval warm period gave way to the early Little Ice Age. Dendrochronological records, tree ring data from the broader region show periods of reduced rainfall in the 12th century that would have reduced agricultural yields across the Cahokia hinterland. The combination of catastrophic flooding around 1100 CE and subsequent drought periods would have created a particularly brutal agricultural crisis. The flood would have destroyed crop stores and contaminated fields. The drought that followed would have prevented recovery. Cahokia was organized around a hierarchical political structure with a paramount chief or ruler at its center. The mound construction, the elaborate burials of the elite, the evidence for sacrificial rituals all indicate a society in which political authority was both substantial and elaborately theatrical. Maintaining that authority required the delivery of material goods and ceremonial services. When environmental catastrophe struck, the political elite's ability to deliver failed. When a hierarchical political system fails to deliver in conditions of crisis, the legitimacy of the hierarchy collapses with it. The ancient DNA from sites across the broader Mississippian cultural sphere shows that populations dispersed from the central Illinois floodplain into new areas during the Cahokia decline. The genetic and isotope signatures of communities that appear in other parts of the Mississippi Valley during the 13th and 14th centuries show characteristics consistent with Cahokia origin populations. The people did not disappear. They went somewhere else. They carried their culture, their genetic ancestry, and their memories of the city with them. The dispersal from Cahokia was not a single migration. It was a scattering back toward the diverse origins from which the city had drawn people. Some went back to the Ohio Valley. Some went south. Some may have gone north into the upper Mississippi watershed. The people were distributed across hundreds of kilometers of river systems, rebuilding, joining existing communities, starting new ones. Case Study 1. The flood of 1100 CE and the political response. The sediment cores from Horseshoe Lake show the 1100 CE flood as one of the most significant hydrological events in the Mississippi Basin in the preceding centuries. The flood deposit is thick and distinct, a marker of an event well beyond the normal range of seasonal flooding. The archaeological response to this flood is visible in the record. The period following the 1100 CE event shows intensified mound construction at Cahokia. Monk's Mound received its final and most expansive phase of construction in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. The interpretation is not that the flood was welcome, but that the political response to it was intensified ritual and construction, an attempt by the Cahokia elite to demonstrate continued control over cosmological forces by accelerating the activities that asserted that control. This pattern, political spectacle as a response to environmental crisis rather than practical remediation, is well documented in complex societies facing collapse. The flood hit. The elite responded by building bigger mounds. The population began to leave. Case Study 2. Isotope evidence of the migration out. The strontium isotope analysis of late-period Cahokia skeletal material shows a population increasingly locally born relative to immigrant, but the same isotope toolkit applied to skeletal material from communities downstream on the Mississippi in what is now Louisiana and Mississippi shows the arrival of individuals with isotope signatures characteristic of the upper Midwest. This is direct evidence of the migration vectors. As Cahokia declined, People moved south and east along the Mississippi and its tributaries. The mound-building cultures of the lower Mississippi Valley show population increases and cultural elaboration during the period of Cahokia's decline. The Natchez in particular, whom French colonists documented in detail in the early 18th century, maintained political and ritual practices continuous with the Cahokia tradition. Pyramid mound building, elaborate chiefly burials, cosmological rituals centered on the sun. The isotope evidence suggests that some of the people who maintained these practices were, in the genetic and geographic sense, Cahokians who had moved south. Case Study 3. Violence and the terminal phase. The final phase of Cahokia's occupation, the late 13th and early 14th centuries, shows increasing evidence of conflict in the skeletal record. Trauma signatures on bones from this period are more frequent than in earlier phases. Evidence for defensive palisade construction around parts of the site intensifies. The people who left earliest likely had the most resources. The immigrants who had come with connections to distant communities and who could call on those connections when Cahokia ceased to offer what it had promised. The people who stayed longest were likely those with the fewest options. The violence in the terminal skeletal record may represent the end of that last population. The most vulnerable, the ones who could not or would not leave until the city was no longer capable of being called a city at all. What the sediment cores, the isotope analysis, and the ancient DNA together establish is a collapse narrative more complex and more humanly recognizable than the vague explanations of earlier scholarship. Cahokia was a real city. It attracted people from hundreds of kilometers away, with the promise of what cities offer: surplus food, specialized labor, political connection, religious meaning. It delivered on those promises for a century or more, and then, beginning with a catastrophic flood around 1100 CE, sustained by drought, agricultural failure, and the political collapse that follows resource crisis, it stopped delivering. The people did not simply die, they left. Gradually, rationally, as families and communities making decisions about where their futures lay. By 1350 CE, the last residents were gone. The mounds stood empty, the fields were growing over, and whatever crisis Europe was experiencing in that century, the Black Death was killing a third of the European population. In these same decades, it had nothing to do with the end of Cahokia. The city on the Mississippi fell to its own internal forces, its own environmental vulnerabilities, its own political failures 200 years before Columbus, long before any European disease could reach it, long before any European eye could see it. Cahokia also forces a reckoning with how we periodize pre-Columbian history. The standard periodization treats 1492 as the dividing line in North American indigenous history, but for the descendants of Cahokia, 1492 was already 150 years into the post-Cahokia era. The transformations they had experienced, the collapse of their metropolitan center, the dispersal of their communities, the redistribution of political authority, were pre-contact events, driven by pre-contact forces. When European contact did come, it came to people who had already survived one civilizational crisis and rebuilt from it. The collapse of Cahokia raises a question the evidence cannot fully answer. How much of what we understand about the collapse of pre-Columbian North American societies is actually about those societies, and how much is about the filtering effect of European contact? The standard narrative describes the decline of complex indigenous civilizations as primarily a consequence of European arrival, the epidemics, the colonial violence, the displacement. This narrative is substantially correct as a description of what Europeans did to indigenous peoples, but Cahokia demonstrates that complex indigenous societies could rise and fall on their own terms. The Cahokia collapse was a pre-contact event, driven by pre-contact forces. It followed the patterns of collapse recognizable in the histories of complex societies worldwide: environmental stress, resource failure, political illegitimacy, and dispersal. The DNA and isotope evidence makes this visible in a way archaeology alone could not. Without the isotope data, Cahokia looked like an abandoned site. You could not tell whether it had been emptied by death or by departure. With the isotope data, the dispersal becomes legible. The people moved. They show up downstream. They carried the tradition with them. The largest city in pre-Columbian North America did not vanish. It relocated, gradually, involuntarily, in response to conditions that made staying impossible. What European arrival did 2 centuries later was to encounter a landscape still reverberating from that relocation. The question the DNA leaves open is this: what would Cahokia's descendants have built given another 200 years without catastrophic contact? The mound-building tradition was still alive and expanding when the Europeans arrived. The collapse of Cahokia had not ended the tradition. It had dispersed it. The bones remember the city. They remember who came to it and who left it, and approximately when and in what direction. What they cannot remember is what those people were building toward. The immigrant character of Cahokia's population was not incidental. It was structural. Cities grow by attracting people from outside. Cahokia was no different. The isotope evidence identifies migrants from the American Bottom region, from the Ohio Valley, from the Great Plains, from the Gulf Coast. Different languages, different ceramic traditions, different burial practices, all converging on a single point in the Illinois floodplain. The trade network that connected Cahokia to the rest of the continent moved copper from the Great Lakes, marine shell from the Gulf, flint from the Ozarks, and agricultural surplus from the surrounding hinterland. These were not casual exchanges. They were the arteries of an urban economy. The debate about Cahokia's nature has practical stakes beyond academic interest. If Cahokia was primarily a ceremonial center, a place people visited but did not live, then its abandonment might be explained by religious or political shifts alone. If it was a genuine permanent city, then its collapse requires a full urban explanation. The isotope evidence settled this. People were living there for years, raising children, burying their dead. The children buried at Cahokia show local isotope signatures, born there, grown up there, drinking the same Mississippi floodplain water their whole short lives. Cahokia was not a pilgrimage site with a permanent staff. It was a city where families lived and children were born. The Horseshoe Lake sediment record is unusual in its completeness. Most flood records are fragmentary. A single event leaves a thin deposit that may not be distinguishable from normal high-water events. The 1100 CE Cahokia flood was large enough to leave a deposit thick enough to be unambiguous at 2,000 years remove. The cores also show that this was not an isolated event. The broader regional flood record from the medieval period shows increased flood frequency across the upper Mississippi watershed. The climate instability that drove the shift from the medieval warm period to the Little Ice Age produced erratic precipitation patterns, alternating flood and drought, that made sustained agricultural production across a large hinterland unreliable. Cahokia was not simply unlucky. It was situated at a geographic node that amplified the effects of climatic instability. The Mississippi River concentrates runoff from a vast drainage basin. A city built on its floodplain is exposed to the full accumulated force of that basin. The Natchez case deserves specific attention because it is so well documented. When French colonists arrived in the lower Mississippi Valley in the early 1700s, they found the Natchez maintaining a society organized around a hereditary sun chief, pyramid mound construction, elaborate death rituals for elite members, and a sharp social hierarchy that distinguished the Great Sunday and his relatives from the commoner class called stinkards. This was not a generically Mississippian society. It was a specifically Cahokia-like society. The practices were too specific, too continuous. The isotope evidence connecting upper Midwest populations to the lower Mississippi provides the geographic mechanism. People moved south, carrying their political tradition. The Natchez were not independent inventors of the sun chief political system. They were, at least partly, the inheritors of it. The question of what Cahokia's descendants might have built is not merely counterfactual speculation. The Mississippian tradition at the time of European contact was dynamic, not static. New mound centers were being constructed in the southeast in the 14th and 15th centuries. Population movements from the Cahokia collapse were seeding new communities that were beginning to stabilize and develop political complexity of their own. The contact era epidemics that killed 50 to 90% of many southeastern populations struck these communities before they had fully rebuilt from the Cahokia dispersal. What was destroyed by European disease was not the remnant of a finished civilization, but a civilization in the process of reconstituting itself after its own internal crisis. The DNA and isotope evidence makes this visible for the first time. Cahokia was not the end of something. It was a disruption in the middle of something. The interruption came from outside. The foundation had been laid from within.